Right, starting our timeline over again, moving away from the animals and thinking about what the plants were doing at the same time. We've already talked about stromatolites that were formed from cyanobacteria, right? And their evolution was a really huge, important event in Earth history because these cyanobacteria were photosynthetic, and they are what caused the great oxygenation event where our atmosphere became oxygen rich, which allowed other plants and animals to also grow and proliferate. Some of the very first plants, some of the very first land plants consist of spores. These are microscopic plant reproductive structures, kind of like the little, or they are the little weird, fluffy, pollen-like things you find on the back of ferns. Those are actually spores. Okay. So these were one of the three major advances in plant evolution. The very first types of plants were seedless spore-bearing plants like these ferns. The next one was the evolution of seed-bearing plants that we call gymnosperms. They have seeds but no flowers. And then the third big advance that happened later in the Mesozoic, so the next era that we're going to talk about next time, was the evolution of plants with seeds and flowers. Right? We call these angiosperms. But getting back to the Paleozoic, right? Before we had flowers, before we had seeds, early Paleozoic plants looked very, very different than the plants we see today. And when they evolved, they drastically changed the landscape and the environment. This is because their roots gripped the soil, held the soil in place, and slowed down erosion. So the landscape went from, just a barren environment where sediment was being transported all over the place, water was all over the place, nothing was really held or stabilized, to all of a sudden, when plants evolved, riverbanks began to stabilize, rivers stayed in place, lakes stayed in place, the soil stayed in place, creating a more constant environment. Even though these original plants were small, the early plants paved the way for the eventual evolution of these large trees. And when these trees evolved, it was super important because the wood allowed the plants to get very, very tall and very, very large, able to withstand gravity and the force of strong winds. So with the evolution of bark and with the evolution of wood, vegetation really took off and started to cover our planet in forests, which hadn't happened before.